But what I'll do is leave it on and switch to the overall view, and then we'll have questions at the end. So I think I can do that. Speak to the speaker view so y'all see that. Though now I will see Christine through the whole of the presentation. Okay.
Not me, I'm muting myself.
So let me review a little bit for those of you who weren't here last time, or those of you who've forgotten, or those of you who went and ate a little breakfast during the last talk. Again, I'm trying over the course of the whole 4 weeks, and at the rate I'm going, I won't do it because I'm so far behind, to try to explain a little bit about how a police shooting leads to a fight over Confederate statues. But I'm also trying to compare memory, the way our society has constructed our view of the Civil War, with the actual history, which is what I'll get to either next time or the time after. And if you remember, I said memory is constructed, but it's frequently contested, which is why you have such differing views of Confederate monuments today, it seems to me. And so last time I was trying to get you to think about 3 very distinct memories of the Civil War that emerge. The first is the African-American memory of the war. And the African-American memory of the war always puts slavery as the cause of the war and emancipation as the central accomplishment of the war. In the minds of African-Americans, particularly Frederick Douglass, who made this point all the way through the war and after, in fact, it's emancipation that makes Union victory possible through the contribution of African-American soldiers and by escalating the nature of the cause, and that essentially it was slavery that led, or the emancipation that led to the preservation of the Union. And so for African-Americans, the message of the war is, this is God's deliverance out of slavery, and it ends not only slavery, but it brings citizenship and equality. And so for them, that's what the Civil War is all about, for the African-American community. And their memory of the war never really changes. The white North, again, operating from the same sort of covenantal theology that both the white South and the African-American community operate from, see victory as God's testimony to their righteousness. They believe during the war they got rid of the small little things. They even got rid of the one sin America had, which was slavery, and therefore they are now fully righteous, and the nation is fully righteous. And so the Northern memory of the war keeps the focus on the preservation of the Union. They make the war about secession. They continue to see the South as having succeeded illegally and acted treasonously and threatened the Union, and that they were wrong and evil to do that. They also believe they have accomplished much in emancipating slaves, and they see the war as also about slavery. But they never put as much emphasis on the ending of slavery as they do on the preservation of the Union, which will become important over time. And for most white Northerners, there are a few that see the African-American vision that what emancipation meant was equality. For most Northerners, even though they believe they were righteous in ending slavery, they don't believe that necessarily leads to any notion of racial equality in the North. And that's an important historical fact that we may come back to. But again, the North celebrates the war in many ways as intensely as the South does in the early days. They tend to put up monuments. They tend to put up monuments earlier. I said last time, and I think I confused some of you, that the North also adopts from the South the idea of Memorial Day, but they have a different day. In other words, Memorial Day is different in the South than it is in the North. But they have reunions, they have monuments, they have a recognition of the soldier, and part of that is a real new emphasis on the military in American society. As I think I told you, there's a historian named Tom Brown who's argued lately that what the celebration of the war does, particularly in statues, is make the typical American not the yeoman farmer, but the army man, the private. So then we're finally looking at the third of our memories that are very different, and that is the South's memory of the war, white South's memory of the war, which people have called the lost cause. Again, there's a covenantal view at work. The white South loses, even though they believe God was on their side, and they come up with this incredible theological justification that what God is doing is punishing them because they are sinless to make them better, and that we'll suffer for a while, but will have greater glory and a greater role in the present. So when the South begins to shift back to an acceptance of nationalism, they can still use that covenantal theology, that still notion of a particular relationship between them and God as part of their nationalism comes very easily for them. They rejoined the North on that. In the immediate aftermath of the war, they see they firmly believe they've done nothing wrong. They believe secession is legal. They believe there was nothing wrong with slavery. And they accept defeat. They accept the end of slavery.
Okay, Kay.
But they also believe they want to maintain their own control over their own lives as much as possible, particularly their state governments. And they are fully committed to white supremacy. Slavery's gone, but we've got to figure out, in their minds, a new way to preserve white supremacy. So you have this tremendous defensiveness at the same time. What the South wants is an affirmation of their honor as soldiers and the honor of their cause. And they desperately need that, and much of the Lost Cause is about providing that. They want signs of respect from the North. If the North wants from the South testimony of loyalty, for the South, what they want from the North are signs of respect, that their honor is being recognized. And so you have this period of mourning early, and then you have this period of real celebration of the South. And this is the heart of the Lost Cause, roughly 1890 to the First World War. And as I talked about last time, you have a continuation of Memorial Day, but it's a much more celebratory Memorial Day. You have veterans organizations, you have descendants organizations, both the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. You have the United Confederate Veterans holding these gigantic reunions once a year, which brings 100,000 people to a southern town to celebrate the Confederacy. And this is the period when most of the Confederate monuments come up. So what I want to do now, having caught you up, I hope, is to say, okay, in the midst of this celebration between 1890 and 1920, what are the basic components of the Lost Cause? What are the basic beliefs of white Southerners about the Civil War? And you start, first of all, that they argue adamantly that the war is not about slavery, but the war is about states' rights. And they go further and say, under any doctrine of states' rights, secession was legal. Secession was constitutional. So in their minds, and in the Lost Cause, and in what they taught themselves and their children, the South had done nothing wrong in succeeding. They had exercised a constitutional authority that was given them under the Constitution, that was a heritage of the American Revolution. And that therefore they had been right and just. And therefore the war itself becomes a war of defense. Their nation is under attack by the North, and they move to defend it. So first of all, states' rights. Secession is legal. Secondly, you've got the problem of the fact that they lost. And that weighs on them because, again, their conceptions of honor and righteousness said they should have won. So they begin to develop a theory of why they lost. And there are two major theories. One that starts, well, they both start early, but one lasts long. One is to blame it on James Longstreet. James Longstreet was a Confederate general who, after the war, becomes a Republican and supports African-American rights, and in fact is involved in fights with white supremacists in New Orleans. He also has the audacity after the war to say, Lee really screwed it up at Gettysburg. And so they begin to turn on Longstreet. And they argue that on the second day at Gettysburg, Longstreet was late launching his attack, which was to some extent true. And they argue that if Longstreet had been on time, we would have won the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate Army would have made it to Washington, and we would have won the war. So the whole reason we lost is Longstreet. Now, nobody thinks much about that anymore. I was really fascinated in the debate over renaming Lehigh. Somebody suggested as a name Longstreet. And I'm really curious as to what they were thinking when they did that. Those post-war Confederates who are most holding on to the idea of Confederate nationalism tended to really like the Longstreet lost it argument because that helped. The more prominent argument is that the South lost to overwhelming numbers and resources. In other words, the Confederates never had a chance because the North had more men, and the North had all the Industrial Revolution and goods. And so we were hopelessly outnumbered and had less material. And so the amazing thing is we fought as long as we did. And that becomes really the dominant memory of the war. And with that, you come to believe that the South actually fought really well. In other words, that's a ratification of the Confederate war effort. And so it's like we fought almost as well as we needed to win, and we fought well enough to win, and we fought heroically and bravely. It was just they had more people, they had more arms, they had more resources. And so again, this notion of a kind of virtual victory in the war, I think, is really played upon by this notion of overwhelming numbers and resources. Those of you who are true devotees of Confederate history will know that phrase is actually used by General Lee in General Orders No. 9. Okay, it didn't work well last time, but I'm going to try to switch to the slides just a little bit now. So a third aspect of this Southern memory of the war is to argue not only did we fight rightly because of states' rights, not only did we fight well enough to win because we had such great armies, we had amazing aristocratic military leaders. And no one is more central to that lost cause memory than Robert E. Lee. That's one reason why to fight over the Lee monuments ultimately makes so much sense. Now, Lee had become a hero even during the war. And a lot of historians and several biographers of Lee would argue that by the middle to the late stages of the Civil War, Lee has become the embodiment of Confederate nationalism. So that when Southerners celebrate Lee, they are to some extent celebrating Confederate nationalism. They are celebrating the cause. But in one of the fascinating ironies of the way memory can work, they also work very hard at disassociating Lee from the cause. So the essence of Lee's reputation is that he is a man of spotless character. He is a general of uncommon abilities and unsurpassed military genius. And after the war, the Southerners begin to talk about this. We'll see later the Northerners really focus on it. He accepts defeat, counsels the South to return to the Union and do what's asked of them. Now, at the same time, they will frequently try to completely disassociate. They will talk about the fact that Lee didn't believe in slavery, which is not true. They will talk about the fact that Lee opposed or didn't believe in secession, and he didn't believe in secession. He thought secession was illegal and that what the South was doing was revolutionary, but he did believe in the revolution. But again, that tendency to disassociate him from the cause. Though there are some daughters of the Confederacy who spent an enormous amount of time trying to prove that Robert E. Lee was taught secession was illegal at West Point, but most people don't agree with that. So Lee is the central hero. And he's fascinating from the South's point of view because you can celebrate the cause at the same time you act like you're celebrating a man. You can celebrate the cause acting like you're not really even talking about the cause. Now, not everybody did that. There was a great speech for the unveiling of the monument to Lee in New Orleans, in which the speaker says, you can't celebrate the man without celebrating his cause. But for the most part, people didn't do it. The second of the great heroes is Stonewall Jackson. As you know, if you know anything about Confederate history, Jackson dies during the war, but Jackson becomes a tremendous hero. And for some of them, it's almost like the reverse of Longstreet. If Jackson had lived, maybe we would have won. Jackson's an interesting hero because he was a ferocious Presbyterian who was one of the bloodiest of the leaders. The third great hero is not a military man, but Jefferson Davis. And Lee has a good sense to die 5 years after the war. Jackson has a good sense to die during the war, so it's easy to become a hero. Davis comes later because some people were mad at him after the war, and he lives longer in 1889 and really only becomes an unvarnished hero after his death. But go back to those monuments I showed you, and it's interesting. Lee's monument in Richmond is in many ways to Lee. Davis's monument is as much to the cause and to the South as it is to Davis. I mean, Davis almost disappears in that monument. And you have the columns representing all the states of the Confederacy. You have the eagles with this tremendously patriotic burst, this ancient figure at the top. So again, Davis is as much a symbol of the cause as none. But those three become the primary heroes of the war. So you have, okay, the war's about states' rights, not slavery, and it was legal, not illegal. We lost the war due to overwhelming numbers, but we were led by the amazing aristocratic leaders. Fourth, they stress that both women and slaves were loyal to the cause. Now, part of that is, again, one of the fears of Confederate veterans is that somehow defeat has undermined their manhood. Somehow losing the war suggests we're not as tough of men as we should be. And so you have this fascinating phenomena that I bring in primarily for Eleanor, and that is this celebration of Winnie Davis, who comes to be called the daughter of the Confederacy, born during the war, an affirmation of Jefferson Davis's manhood and essentially the South's manhood. Remember that picture when we talk about the Confederate flag. It's very interesting to me that there are two Confederate flags in that picture. Here's another picture of Union. And she becomes known as the daughter of the Confederacy, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy pick up on that name. She's named that before the daughters are. That whole celebration of manhood comes up in interesting ways in the reunions. One of the things that happens, and again, they're to some extent modeled on Winnie, is at Confederate reunions, and not that you did not have at Northern Veterans reunions, you have these bizarre celebrations in which every Confederate camp brought a representative young woman dressed in white, a sponsor who was then presented to the veterans. And I'm not a big Freudian, but young women dressed in white suggest virgins to me. And you have this phenomenon. And at one of the South Carolina reunions, one of the sponsors got up and threw out her arms and said, "We love you, Confederate veterans. We only regret that unlike our mothers, we can't marry you." So again, this testimony of women's loyalty, but also Confederate manhood. With the slaves, even at Confederate reunions, you would bring a few African Americans who were given drinks and treated well, who had served during the war, not as Confederate veterans, but as servants, and people would emphasize that. So you have this celebration of women's loyalty and the enslaved loyalty to the Confederacy and to the South. And finally, over time, you also have the emergence of another interesting aspect to the argument, and that is a focus on the destruction of the war. We talked a little bit about this last time in response to some of the questions. And the symbol of that, in many ways, becomes Sherman. Though Sherman's fascinating, as I assume many of you know, Sherman was the first president of LSU and remains very friendly to LSU after the war. David Boyd was gotten out of a POW camp by Sherman, so he always remained a friend. But Sherman actually came and gave the commencement address at LSU in 1869. And I can't remember exactly, but either that year or shortly thereafter, he was the king of Mardi Gras. But over time, there comes to be an emphasis on the destructiveness of the war, the destructiveness and the brutality of the Yankees, and Sherman becomes a symbol of that. And Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia becomes a symbol of that. Even that is interesting in that Sherman's march through South Carolina is much more destructive than it is through Georgia, but it's always Georgia that gets credit, I guess, because of the song. So there's this emphasis on the destruction of the war, that the South is devastated by Yankee brutality and Yankee savagery and Yankee destructiveness. So if you take, and you could add other parts to the Lost Cause, but if you take my five parts, what have they done? They said, okay, first of all, secession is legal and the war was a legal exercise of constitutional authority. It had nothing to do with slavery. We were therefore right that we lost only because of overwhelming numbers and resources. We were led by these amazing aristocratic figures and generals, and the women and the enslaved supported us. And despite all that, we had to suffer the destruction of the Yankees. So the South, the white South, has created this really fascinating memory, which makes them a memory that is at once vindicated. In other words, they feel vindicated, they feel virtually victorious, and yet can still see themselves as victims. And I think that's tremendously important. Now, I think many of the people who argue that all of what we're going through today is still fighting the Civil War would talk about the perpetuation of Confederate nationalism through the Lost Cause. Again, I warned you at the very beginning last time that you're getting Gaines's view, not necessarily the dominant view among the historical profession. You can argue about whether Confederate nationalism ever existed during the war, much less after it, but I don't believe that what we're talking about in the Lost Cause is a perpetuation of Confederate nationalism. I don't even see in the Lost Cause a perpetuation of an ideology. But what it does do is imprint on Southern society and in the white Southern mind a deeply conservative social vision. I mean, the whole celebration of the Lost Cause at the turn of the century includes aristocratic leaders to whom loyal soldiers deferred. And that becomes the model of the proper common man. I mean, this is very much a hierarchical society that demands deference from the lower class. At the same time, it's a social vision. Again, as I talked about in response to Ann Jones's question last time, there's a contesting vision by some women. But at the heart of the Lost Cause is this notion of subservient women. And at the heart of the Lost Cause, the role of African Americans is subservient as well. So the Lost Cause very much is not purely about white supremacy, but white supremacy is very much a part of it. Along with that, North and South, what you have is a celebration of the military. It contributes to a growing militarization of American society in the late 19th century. Perhaps even deeper than that, it seems to me the Lost Cause helps imprint into the white Southern culture two other things that are, one of them I've already kind of talked about, and that's the acceptance of authority, but also loyalty to group. In other words, those rituals, those monuments, they're a celebration of region and race. They're a celebration of Southernness and whiteness. And as often in a conservative mindset, there's an attachment to symbols as well, so that the symbols that we'll talk about later take on particular power in the South because they're associated with this whole sort of conservative mindset that's embedded, not purely, but in part by the Lost Cause. I don't know whether Jerry's with us today, but he's a big fan of Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, which is a social psychology of modern conservatism. And again, it seems to me what the Lost Cause does is send in many of the same values that shape that conservative mind and shape the region for a century and a half to come. Now, in talking about the Lost Cause and talking about the Southern memory of the war, I tend to define the Lost Cause purely in terms of what it says about Civil War. Other people would include two other things, but I don't include them, but I think they're very important to remember. And those two things are, along with this distinctive view of Civil War history, you have, first of all, the celebration of the Old South. So after the war, not only do Southerners say, white Southerners say, war wasn't about slavery. They go further and they say, but anyway, there's nothing wrong with slavery. And so you begin to have this celebration of slavery. Again, it's memory serving the function of the present. If slavery was a great thing, what can be wrong with white supremacy today? So again, it's not unrelated to the modern way people think. But they say nothing's wrong with slavery. They argue that the slaves were well treated. They argue that the slaves were loyal and happy, things you probably heard before. And so the plantation becomes this idyllic world. And it's interesting in that it's a world of grace and wealth, but not necessarily of work. And that's one of the fascinating things when you even today visit plantations. It's the wonders of living in the big house. It's the wonders of how they live this gracious life, not the work that made it possible. And again, the plantation and this vision of the Old South is embraced South and North because it offers a vision that allows an escape from the commercialism of the late 19th and early 20th century. And so this sort of pro-slavery view takes hold. And again, it goes south as well as north. It's adopted by scholars in very dangerous ways throughout much of the 20th century, white scholars. There's a very famous historian of abolition who said, even at Harvard in the 1940s and 50s in graduate school, I was still taught pretty much a pro-slavery view of slavery. So it becomes widespread. Along with the lost cause, along with the celebration of the Old South, you also have the memory of Reconstruction. And if we ever get to the history, we'll talk a lot about Reconstruction. But the white South creates a memory of Reconstruction that makes Reconstruction a policy of Northern vengeance. They make it a horrendous mistake in which the South was put under black rule, helped along by dastardly white politicians and carpetbaggers. And you had a period of incredible savagery and evil and corruption and problems until the Ku Klux Klan and other white groups liberated the South from black rule and restored democracy and order. Again, I would argue that in many ways in shaping behavior in the 20th century, the memory of Reconstruction may be more important than the memory of the Civil War. And that memory of Reconstruction becomes equally widespread. By the early 20th century, it's adopted by most scholars. The whole theory of evil Reconstruction is called the Dunning School, after a guy named Dunning who taught at Columbia University and was from the North. So he trained mostly Southerners, including some people who taught at LSU. But the fascinating thing is, as important as the memory of the Civil War, of the Reconstruction is, you don't have all the monuments going up to Reconstruction the way you do the Civil War. Now, Louisiana, which was, and we may talk about this later, is a particularly brutal form of Reconstruction. The bloodshed of maintaining white supremacy in Louisiana is worse than almost any state. South Carolina would be almost equal. The fact that I lived in both is just purely accidental. But you have, in Louisiana, you actually have in Colfax and in the Liberty Place Monument, two of the very few monuments specifically to Reconstruction. So again, monuments don't necessarily prove all that important because the memory of Reconstruction is very, very strong. The other thing about Reconstruction is it lets the South win. One historian's argued that reconciliation came because the North got to win the Civil War and the South got to win Reconstruction. But the Southern view of Reconstruction wins. And that's important for the maintenance of white supremacy. Now, last time Jacob asked me I said, okay, what changes? And what I've been talking about is what's happening to the memory of the Civil War between about 1890 and 1910 or 1915. That's the heart of this lost cause. By the 1920s, things have changed a bit. African Americans have not changed their view of the Civil War. They still believe the war is about slavery, and emancipation meant equality and citizenship. But by that time, as we'll see when we get to the history section, they have lost most of their access to the public world and certainly to political power. And so their memory persists, but primarily within the African American community, and is even more ignored than it ever was before. The North hasn't changed its mind. The North still sees it's right. And if you push them, they'll say secession is treason. And if you push them, they'll say the war was really about slavery. On the other hand, by the 1920s, they've got firm evidence of what they wanted from the South, which is evidence of loyalty. So the South was on the North side in the rebellions of labor and anarchists and socialists in the 1880s and 90s. The South fought in the Spanish-American War. The South fights in World War I. And so by that time, they've seen the evidence they need of Southern loyalty. And so they're willing to celebrate Confederate military abilities. In other words, the memory of the war comes to focus primarily on the battlefield. And the white North is more than happy to talk about the heroism of Confederate soldiers. I mean, think about it. Analogy that may work for you. Coach O after beating Alabama. He gets interviewed, he says, well, you know, that Alabama football team is really, really good. But we beat them. In other words, the North doesn't mind praising Southern soldiers because it just means their victory is more real. So there's a celebration of the Confederate military effort. And otherwise, both sides just don't talk about the issues. And we still live with that. And you can see this happening in interesting ways in the 20s with Robert E. Lee. Again, the nation embraces Lee, maybe even earlier, but certainly by the 1920s. So one of the things we're fighting over today that I don't know whether we'll get to is the name of forts. This is the period right after World War I when Fort Lee is named after Robert E. Lee. Lee's picture goes back up in West Point. The two most interesting is a Republican president agrees for the federal government to create Cohens to raise money to put Lee, Davis, and Jackson on Stone Mountain in Georgia. So the federal government supporting the creation of the Stone Mountain Monument, if you've ever been there. Even more importantly is what happens at Arlington in the 1920s. Arlington had been Lee's home, as you may know. And as soon as the war starts, the Northerners capture it. It's right across the river from Washington. It ain't hard to do. And Lee remains incredibly bitter about that for the rest of his life. Well, they first turn it into a Freedmen's Bureau camp. In other words, a place to house former enslaved people, which they see as terribly insulting to Lee's memory and get a big chuckle out of. And then they make it a national cemetery to bury Union veterans, equally insulting. So you can see early after the war this opposition to Lee. In 1924, Congress, at the behest of a Northern Republican, decides to refurbish Lee's house at Arlington and make it more central to the National Cemetery. So you're bringing in a sort of symbol of the Old South, but also a house closely associated with Lee, and they talk about it as a memorial to Lee, that really forms this column from the Lee Mansion across the river through the Lincoln Memorial into the Capitol. And so you've really brought Lee back into it. And again, the North likes Lee because they seize on Lee, as a military hero. And again, the war is about militarization in their minds. But they also seize on Lee by stressing he brought the nation back together, that Lee accepted and fostered reunion. And so really by the 20s, you not only have reunion, but a great deal of reconciliation. And you've got the North not having changed its mind, but nevertheless very much caught up in the sort of lost cause view of the war. And the 30s just enhanced that. In the 1930s, when you've got the Great Depression, people are looking for people to celebrate who survive adversity. And so that becomes a theme of the Confederacy. The Confederacy, remember, has portrayed itself as destroyed by the war, but survives. Think Scarlet. I mean, it's a typical example of that. So by the 30s, the Southern view in many ways has become much more of a national view than it ever has before. The next big stage then becomes the Centennial and the Civil Rights era, which come together in fascinating ways. And you can see the themes I'm talking about in the Centennial. When the United States creates a Centennial Commission in the late 50s to celebrate the Civil War centennial, they think it, in the midst of the Cold War, will provide a wonderful opportunity to celebrate nationalism, national unity, and military sacrifice. And they very much envision the centennial as a kind of nationalistic, patriotic celebration. And again, based on this compromise. Don't talk about the issues, talk about both sides being right and both sides fighting heroic. Even before it starts, it gets caught up in the Civil Rights Movement. They're going to have a meeting of the Civil Rights Commission in Charleston, South Carolina, and there's a black member of the New Jersey delegation, and no one in Charleston will rent him a hotel room. And so that begins to intertwine the Civil Rights Movement and the Commission, and it all begins to fall apart. But you still have not a tremendous celebration with the centennial, but a celebration with the centennial. At the same time, you have the Civil Rights Movement. And the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement leads to a reviving of Confederate symbolism. I'll talk at great length, looks like it's going to be next time, about the Confederate flag and how all that plays out. We in Baton Rouge know it. Remember, when is Lee High School named? 1959, Southtown subdivision with all its Confederate streets about the same time. So that again, as the Civil Rights Movement begins to threaten segregation, you have this revival of Confederate symbolism and Confederate imagery and Confederate history. The segregationists
I think you look terrible.
try to use that memory to mobilize the South. And within limits, it has some impact. But most people who study the centennial, I think, rightly argue that it doesn't work. That there's not enough power. It's not an ideology. It's not a nationalism. It's just a series of symbols and a vision of society for it to work. That unified view doesn't altogether disappear. As late as 1975, when they discover Robert E. Lee's request for pardon and his oath of loyalty that somehow had gotten lost. In 1975, Congress will vote to give Robert E. Lee his citizenship back. And if you read the debates, it sounds just like what the Northerners were saying about Arlington in 1924. The only difference is there are 12 negative votes. And it's a great example of how memory works. And that is, those negative votes were Democrats who were saying, okay, if you're going to give Lee his citizenship back, give citizenship back to Vietnam War resistors who want to come back to America. So memory gets taught up in the present. Now, my argument would be that by the 1990s, things have changed in fairly fundamental ways, and I'll try to do them real fast so we don't get even further behind, or I don't get even further behind. I would argue that overwhelmingly there is a generally declining interest in the Civil War. In 1994, almost half of Americans said the war doesn't mean much to me personally. 40%, even among the Southerners, said put it behind us. Very few Southerners know anything about the war. Only a third know that they have an ancestor. A third know that they don't. The other third are a little confused. Some of them have ancestors on both sides. There's still what I would call sub-communities that are obsessed with the war. You've got in Baton Rouge and other places, though they started in the North, not in the South, and they started in the 1960s, 50s. Civil War roundtables, people who get together once a month to study Southern Civil War history. You can see their pictures in the Baton Rouge family section sometimes. You've got something I didn't talk about, Civil War reenactors, who began really about the time of the centennial and remain a sort of strong subcommunity. But I think most people don't get too excited about it. Go to Barnes and Noble and look at the bookshelf. The sections for World War II are usually bigger than they are for the Civil War. And if you watch the bestseller list, the histories that are most likely to make the bestseller list are about the Revolution, not the Civil War. Or even more importantly, even in the 1890s, at the heart of all this celebration of Civil War, you have the emergence of yet another American myth, which is the West, which I think becomes even more popular. But in any case, insofar as people care about it, everything has changed because of the Civil Rights Movement. The first and most important change is that after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and massive voting registration in the late 1960s, suddenly African Americans, whose emphasis on the war is about slavery, the achievement of the war is emancipation, and that demands equality and citizenship. That memory of the war, which had been silenced for 80 years, now African Americans have the political power and the cultural power to force Americans to pay attention to that. That's a fundamental change. The second change is that if you look at the cultural elite, if you look at the dominant forces within American culture, they've changed from being pro-slavery and to a certain extent buying into the lost cause to a very different view of the war. Interestingly, so much of it happens between about 1988 and 1991 or 92. And you have, in 1988, a historian by the name of James McPherson was a Pulitzer Prize for a book called The Battle Cry of Freedom, which is very much an interpretation of the Civil War, stressing the role of slavery. In that same 2 or 3 year period, you have Ken Burns' study of the Civil War on LPB. Burns is not totally free from the old romantic notions at all, but he still makes slavery part of the war. You have in 1989 the movie Glory. Now, if you think about the early movie industry, when the two biggest Civil War movies were Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, and then you think about Glory, which is a study of the 54th Mass and their battle for freedom of African American soldiers, you see how the dominant national culture has really changed. Throw into that the Free State of Jones, throw into that Lincoln, which makes the war almost all about slavery, not all about slavery, but mostly about slavery. And you see how things have changed. The National Park Service has begun to change in how it deals with slavery and making slavery much more in part from pressure from Jesse Jackson Jr. in the Senate. So things have changed at the national level. At the same time, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, you've had a growing neo-Confederate reaction. It begins often with individuals in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So you've got a guy named Richard Weaver, who got his PhD at LSU, I'm somewhat embarrassed to make. Or even more importantly, M.E. Bradford, who wrote books about how Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant and very much a pro-Southern view. Bradford becomes head of the National Endowment of Humanities under Reagan. In 1979, you have a sort of neo-Confederate magazine called The Southern Partisan that's being published, including a guy from Baton Rouge. You have a series of books, Southern by the Grace of God, or The South Was Right, which if you used to shop in local bookstores, you would see. The sons of the Confederate veterans that had been virtually unimportant at the turn of the century, become much more active, still a very small group. But the sons of Confederate veterans, far more than the daughters in the 80s and 90s, becomes influential. Very small group, briefly taken over by hardcore white supremacists. They were briefly on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate list, but they're not on there right now. You have their revival. And most importantly, in the 90s, you have a group formed called the League of the South. Formed, strangely enough, by 3 academics. I take some consolation in the fact that 2 of them came from the University of Alabama. And the League of the South still believes in secession. It's still on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate group list. It believes in secession. It's an ardent belief in white supremacy and very much tied to the lost cause, though it accepts a lot of ideals and ideas that were never part of the lost cause. Michael Hill, who's the head of one of the major figures in the League of the South, and representatives of the League of the South, were present both at the moment the Lee Monument came down in New Orleans and the Lee Monument battle in Charlottesville later. So you have, since the 90s, a much more contested memory. One of the things I want to try to show you with looking at the fights over symbols is how the lines of that division are much more complex and much less tied to the Civil War than we think about. But I am beyond my time. So let me stop there and I'll try to figure out how to get all the rest of it in later. But anyway, if you got questions, just ask.
Gaines, I have a question. I was struck by your point that the sort of romanticization of plantations was in some ways a response to late 19th century industrialization. Is that what you're saying? That the sort of ugliness of the late 19th century economy caused some people to harken back to a glamorized,
it's an escape. And I mean, it begins before that. There's a plantation literature that actually predates the Civil War.
Right.
But certainly after the Civil War, white Southerners write all these books celebrating the plantation, most of which sell in New York City.
Because it's a nice contrast to all those ugly.
Contrast to all the ugly stuff. Now, again, I think the whole celebration of the Civil War is tied to the same thing. And in fact, at this period when society is changing so much and so fast, there's a rediscovery of history. That's when the AHA forms. Yeah. That's, but no, there's no question. And it still is. I mean, I still think that's one of the reasons plantation museums survive so well today. It's a world free from all that. I mean, it's all we'll talk about when we get to the history section. It's all based on an incredibly expansive capitalistic system, but we don't look at that part of the plantation.
I just never had put the two together, that, the sort of industrialization and urbanization of America encourages nostalgia for an imagined plantation past.
Right. Exactly.
James, I'm struck several times by your mention of Gone with the Wind and remembering raised in Ohio, 60s and 70s. I was fascinated with Gone with the Wind. Does it have a role to play, the book? When was the book published?
The book comes out, I think, 37, the movie 39. The book may be a little earlier than that.
Because the movie was huge.
The movie is huge. And again, think about it. It's made by Hollywood, California people with actors aren't from the South. I mean, it's a perfect example of sort of Southerners getting their vision of themselves from somebody else. Most people would argue that the book is much more complex than the movie, and so that's not altogether fair.
I would agree. Yeah.
But no, the movie becomes incredibly influential, and again, it's very much a sort of romanticized view with very little other than the white supremacy ideological content for the Southern side. I mean, to me, Scarlett is to me a great figure that she decides, hell, I'm going to sell out and become like everybody else and make money. Screw you.
You're right. It seems like the book was very was clearly a part of this whole process, that it was
Yes,
written.
very much. I mean, it's
Very much so.
extremely important in solidifying that sort of romanticized view of the war. But even more importantly, the romanticized view of the Old South.
James,
Mhm.
thanks for sharing Winnie.
Anytime.
Why'd you say remember the flag in that picture?
Because there are two flags. If you notice, there's the
told them.
official
Yeah.
civil flag and there's a battle flag. And one of the things I'll do if we talk about the symbols next time is talk about the fact that the battle flag at that point is not the only Confederate flag the way it'll be by the 1950s and 60s.
Okay, thanks.
Hey,
So
James,
actually, the League of the South guys, the crazies, are trying to bring that flag back, but they also have their own. Any other questions? I just wore you out this time. Well, we will stop and you will all cease thinking about evil memories and center yourself for the scriptures.
James?
Yeah. Hey, Jerry.
Can you hear me,
Yeah,
James?
I
Yes,
just
Jerry.
wanted to, I was interested mostly in, when I was teaching, in the sort of the literary amalgamation of North and South through Reconstruction, the popularity of plantation novels and so forth. You have those writers like Charles Chestnut who stirred up bad memories, but I was going to ask you how much of the sort of the white supremacy in the North was actually sort of triggered by the Great Migration during the First World War.
Yeah, great question. And I hope I'll get to all of that. If I don't run out of time, I got to figure out what to do because I'm going to talk about that. I always, there's some studies that I haven't read, but I've read about that talk about the degree of racism in any place is tied to numbers. So, you know, white folks in Vermont are pretty cool on race.
Yeah,
White folks in Chicago aren't.
right.
And so to that extent, I think the first Great Migration between 1915 and 1930 enhances that.
Yeah.
But there's increasing evidence in redlining and other things that I hope I'll talk about as time goes on, that segregation in the North begins from the beginning. In other words, it's not that after all these African Americans arrive, there's a racist response, but rather that you begin to create that racial system in the urban North, even as it's happening. And so I do think that makes a difference.
Yeah.
But you know, even the Union Army had tremendous problems with racism. And one of the reasons why the South can get away with ending Reconstruction and securing white supremacy is most Northerners just don't care. But there's no question that the first migration makes it worse in the North, in certain sense. The second migration intensifies it. And my argument, which we may not get to, would be that the racial unrest between and rioting between 63, 64, and 68 make race a national issue in ways that had never really been seen before.
Yeah.
We're in Charlottesville for the next few weeks. The last time we were here, it was right after the event, as they like to call it. And Lee was draped in black plastic garbage bags. They couldn't take it down.
Oh, wow.
Bag. So we'll check it out this week and let you know where it is.
I'll be able to, I think the legislature changed the law, but I'm not sure exactly where they were on it when the Democrats took control.
James?
Yes.
Yeah, I understand that you said earlier that you believe what's happening now has more to do with Reconstruction than the Civil War. And of course, it was Lincoln who actually first came up with the notion of Reconstruction. Do you see what's happening now an extension of that, or what you would call a neo-Reconstruction?
Well, let me correct myself a little bit. I think over the course of the 19th and much of the 20th century, the memory of Reconstruction may be more powerful than the memory of the Civil War.
Oh, okay.
So, for instance, even in '57, Eisenhower has to think twice about sending troops to Little Rock because he's worried about evoking memories of Reconstruction. Kennedy used as an excuse for his timidity on civil rights. I'm actually, if I ever get there, going to argue that the current debate is much more just purely about race, and that even sectional lines in general are not as clear as they once were.
Okay.
So I don't see this as fully playing out Reconstruction or the Civil War.
Haynes, I have a real quick question.
Mhm.
And as they say on the Jim Inkster show or things, I'll have to take my answer off the air because I've got to go to UPC in about 2 minutes. You talked about the reenactors and all these other groups. Can you say something about, because it's interesting, because it was in the 80s too that you had the reunification of churches. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some of that phenomenon
Yeah.
that's going on with Methodists and Presbyterians and various groups.
Yeah.
How we divide.
Well, you're talking about several different groups. The Baptists and the Methodists split not over the Civil War, but over slavery. And they split in 84, 85 over slavery, and it's clear. Presbyterians kind of halfway split over slavery for a while, and then they split in 61 when the war starts. And the Episcopalians actually get back together right after the war, and then have to deal with race, and end up creating a kind of all-black diocese within the church in the 1880s and 90s. The Methodists get back together in the 30s. The Presbyterians are the last. And I think those splits become partly regional, partly racial, partly theological, and they're harder to put back together. To give due justice to people who see all this differently, there's a school of thought that's probably more widely accepted in the profession than mine, that sees the lost cause as a civil religion, and sees all this as a kind of religious belief, and that therefore those southern denominations and the holding of independent regional denominations is all part of that and tied up with that civil religion, and therefore that's why it takes so long to get back together.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
So this whole reenactment movement didn't start till the 80s? Is that what you're saying?
No, not quite. Reenactments actually start during the war, strangely enough, where soldiers reenact battles for their civilians at home. After the war, there are some reenactments, but they tend to be by soldiers. And my favorite example, which is just a wonderful example of how you cannot reenact history, is I read about one reenactment, I think it's in the 80s and 90s, in which somebody fell, hurt themselves, and started bleeding. And since he was bleeding, they stopped the reenactment. But you have that going on, like in 1913, when you have the Gettysburg reunion, which becomes a great symbol of reunification. They reenact Pickett's charge, though they have a little fight about how far the Southerners got. So throughout that, but the real reenactment movement, kind of as a hobby, probably dates primarily from the Civil War centennial.
Okay.
And then is enhanced by the movie Glory, because Glory uses a large number of reenactors.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of in decline. There are actually studies that suggest that there are more reenactors of World War II than there are of the Civil War today. And as a percentage of the population, there are more reenactors of the English Civil War than there are of the American Civil War. But
It makes me think of our late colleague Charlie Royster's observation that he'd be more impressed by Civil War reenactors if they used real bullets.
Actually, I'll tell you a story I shouldn't tell you. I quoted him that way as saying that he's disappointed or something. They should have used real bullets. I had a friend who then put that in a book review, which led to the editor of the book review, the editor of the journal being fired for that comment. for which I felt very, very guilty and very, very relieved that my friend didn't tell me where they got the quote. That may be a good place to stop. I answer questions by email.
All right.
So it's
Thank
been
you,
fun.
Gabe.
Good to see you. See you next week.
Yay, thanks, Gabe.
Bye.
Thank you, Gaines.
It's a pleasure.
Good job, Gaines.
Thanks, Christine. See,
I see
you
you
taught
took
me how
the
to do
dark
that.
background trick, huh?
Yeah, you taught me how to do it.
Yeah, there you go.
Thanks, Gaines. That was great.
Okay, thanks, Ava. Bye-bye.
Terrific. Bye-bye.